The check was already on the table when my daughter-in-law raised her glass and smiled. Some of us don't live off the past. Still, I didn't blink, just let my fingers brush the receipt she hadn't noticed was mine. As her laughter danced between wine glasses, the ink on the bill darkened under the pendant light. While my son looked down, pretending not to hear, the silence between us said everything. That's when I realized. They weren't just performing wealth. They were sitting on my foundation. The same family who mocked my legacy forgot who paid for the table they toast at. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The terrace grill buzzed softly, the clink of glass and silverware blending with murmured conversations, all carefully curated in the warm amber glow of pendant lights. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, the quiet edge of a gathering she'd never quite belonged to, but had been invited to nonetheless. She wasn't sure who had orchestrated this family dinner, but as she looked across at the polished faces around her, her son, his wife, their son, it felt more like a performance than a gathering. Vanessa's bright laugh cut through the ambient noise, the kind of laugh that seemed always just a little too rehearsed. She raised her glass, a glint of self-satisfaction in her smile, and said, "To building something for ourselves, not just living off the past." The room quieted for a second, then erupted in polite chuckles. The kind of laugh that didn't reach the eyes but made the air feel just a little thicker. Eric shifted in his seat, eyes darting to Margaret, then away, as if looking at her was some unspoken betrayal. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't even flinch. She just sat there, her fingers wrapped around her wine glass, watching the interaction unfold, the sting of Vanessa's words lingering longer than it should have. The laughter faded quickly, as if it were something they were all supposed to move past. Eric cleared his throat, his voice stiff. "So, how's that new project of yours, Mom? The morning light thing?" His attempt to change the subject was predictable, but not effective. Vanessa shot a quick, sharp glance at Eric, then back at Margaret. A moment of tension hung before she turned away, adjusting the collar of her perfectly pressed blouse. Leo, fidgeting beside his mother, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table in a rhythm that no one else seemed to notice but Margaret. She could feel him looking at her. He always did, those curious, uncertain glances, as if trying to understand how to bridge the gap between what was expected and what was actually real. Margaret's hands were steady as she cut into her steak, the blade gliding through the tender meat with a quiet precision that mirrored her life. Slow, deliberate, not rushed. The conversation around her spiraled, a blur of house renovations, upcoming trips, and vague references to future endeavors. All of it, every word, came with an undertone of assertion, of proving something, of proving that they were doing just fine. As the last remnants of food were cleared from the table, Margaret's thoughts drifted, and she allowed herself to recall the decades of quiet patience, the years of investments made without fanfare or declaration. It wasn't flashy, what she'd built. It wasn't loud. But it had endured while this facade of success that sat in front of her felt brittle. The server arrived discreetly, placing the check in front of Vanessa with a polite nod. Vanessa's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of confusion as she stared at the bill. Margaret noted it, the way the corners of Vanessa's lips pulled tight, the way her fingers lingered over the edge of the slip. Leo glanced at the bill, then up at his mother. For a moment he seemed unsure of something, of the expectation, of what he should say, if anything at all. Margaret noticed, and for a brief second, she saw the young man beneath the polished surface, still trying to fit pieces of the world into the framework he had been given. But Vanessa recovered quickly, her hand sweeping over the bill, her fingers brushing it aside as if it were an inconvenience. "Oh, don't worry, we'll take care of it," she said, her voice lilting just a little too high, an attempt at brushing away any discomfort to keep the illusion intact. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The bill wasn't hers to settle. The silence that followed seemed to stretch too long, too loaded, but Margaret felt no need to break it. She let the weight of the moment settle, just as she had always let things fall where they would. For years, she had chosen silence over confrontation, strategy over emotion. She had let the world think she was out of step with them, that she was caught in the past. But the truth was, she had been playing the long game, and they were still catching up. As Vanessa grabbed the check, Margaret let her gaze flicker briefly to the edge of her purse, where the edges of a platinum trust card peeked out. It was the quietest of symbols, but it meant something more than any gesture of a meal, more than any carefully placed toast. It was the measure of a quiet power that didn't need to announce itself. And as Margaret quietly excused herself from the table, the room full of smiles and polite chatter felt a little more distant, a little less real. The dinner was over, but the story had only just begun. The hum of the restaurant lingered as Margaret made her way toward the door, her steps measured, as if each one held a quiet weight. The evening had unfolded with familiar precision, a dance of words and glances, all wrapped in the polished sheen of wealth and subtle power. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, Margaret allowed herself a single breath of relief. The evening was done, and yet, the story had barely begun. Back at the car, she slid into the passenger seat, the soft leather creaking as she adjusted her coat. For a moment, she let her gaze rest on the family trust card tucked into the corner of her purse. The sight of it had an odd way of settling her, reminding her of the years spent planning and building, quietly, steadily. Margaret had known the moment she'd handed it over that Vanessa's smile would falter, just the slightest hint of confusion in her eyes. There was power in that card. Not just in the fact that it was platinum, but in what it represented. It was a small thing, an innocuous gesture in the face of a far larger story, but Margaret had never been one to reveal more than was necessary. The evening hadn't been about revenge. Not yet. Her fingers grazed the edges of the card again before she tucked it back in its place and took the receipt from her purse. She hadn't needed to look at it. She had been watching Vanessa's reaction closely enough. The bill had been settled, and it wasn't going to be her problem to explain. As Margaret placed the receipt into her bag, she allowed herself a moment to look back, to trace the events in her mind like the carefully folded layers of a letter. It wasn't just about the dinner or the mocking toast. It was about the slow, inevitable unraveling that had begun. She could feel it now, like the hum of a distant storm, just on the horizon. It was only a matter of time before they would have to face it. The car's engine purred to life, and as the streetlights flickered past the window, her thoughts drifted back to a night nearly 10 years ago, one of the quietest decisions she had ever made. Flashback. 10 years ago. The weight of grief was still fresh, but Margaret had long ago learned that emotions, no matter how sharp, needed to be managed, to be contained. Her husband had passed unexpectedly, leaving behind a legacy of investments that had once been thriving but now felt like a burden. It had been Carolyn's voice on the other end of the line, calm, steady, the anchor Margaret needed. "You need to diversify, Margaret. What you have now is too tied up in one place. You need options." And so, they did it. They liquidated the investments, moved everything into new ventures, properties, LLCs, a mix of conservative and calculated risk. Carolyn had warned her to be patient, to let time do its work, to trust in the long game. "You're playing the long game," Carolyn had said, her voice sharp with approval. "They won't notice. Not for a while." Margaret had listened, She'd trusted Carolyn, and together they'd built something steady, something far beyond what her son and daughter-in-law could even comprehend. But the game had always been quiet, always under the surface. Back in the present, Margaret sat in the car, the hum of the engine still echoing in the silence. She pulled out her phone and opened the trust ledger, a digital archive of all her holdings. 4 properties, 2 LLCs, 0 debts. It was a neat list, unassuming on the surface, but each item held its own quiet story of foresight, of patient, unspoken decisions that would outlast the fleeting bursts of flash and bravado that surrounded her. She checked the ledger twice just to be sure. Nothing had changed. A soft smile tugged at her lips. Reminder: power doesn't brag. She added the sticky note to the digital file, as much a mental reminder as a written one. Margaret knew that her silence was the thing that would confuse them most. She knew it wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about control. About knowing when to speak, and when to let them stew in their own assumptions. As she tapped the screen to close the ledger, Margaret glanced up at the rearview mirror. A familiar sense of purpose settled in her chest, as if she had been preparing for something much larger than what had unfolded that evening. The dinner had only been the first act, the introduction to the story. What mattered now was what came next. As the streetlights blurred into the darkness, Margaret let herself feel a rare flicker of satisfaction. She had made her move. The game was already in motion, and this time, she wouldn't be the one left in the past. The front door swung open with the exaggerated smoothness of a new hinge. Margaret stepped inside, feeling the sleek, sterile air of the house hit her immediately. The smell wasn't unpleasant, just new. Plastic and fresh wood, the faint scent of fresh paint and polish, a home that had been scrubbed, rebranded, and carefully curated. It didn't smell like history. It didn't smell like comfort. It smelled like something else. Something temporary. Eric and Vanessa's home was the picture of wealth without warmth, all sharp edges and smooth surfaces. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, lit by recessed lights that illuminated the gleaming hardwood floors. Every wall, every corner, screamed money, but there was no life here, no imprint of time lived. Margaret followed Vanessa, who moved with the practiced grace of someone who had done this too many times. She pointed out the upgrades with a polished smile, explaining each detail with a note of pride that Margaret knew wasn't about the craftsmanship, it was about showing off. The Italian marble countertops, the sleek fixtures, the state-of-the-art appliances. Each word was carefully calibrated, each tour a chance to boast without seeming too eager. And here, Vanessa said, stepping aside to reveal the kitchen, the centerpiece of the house. Top-of-the-line appliances. This range? It's from Italy. You can't get anything like it anywhere around here. Margaret didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her gaze moving from the brushed stainless steel to the quartz countertops that gleamed under the overhead lights, their cold perfection reflecting back at her. She ran her fingers across the edge, feeling the slick surface, the immensity of it. Everything here was immaculate, untouched, too clean, too perfect. But as her hand passed over the smooth counter, a faint but familiar crinkle caught her eye, the edge of a statement sticking out from under a pile of unopened mail. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she let her fingers linger on the quartz for a moment longer, giving Vanessa the space to finish her tour, to continue her enthusiastic recounting of the work they'd done, the amount of money they'd spent. All the while, Margaret felt the slow, deliberate sinking of her stomach. The feeling that something was wrong, that this house was more than just an upgrade. It was a metaphor. For what, exactly, she wasn't sure yet. Leo, standing awkwardly by the kitchen island, shifted his weight from foot to foot. Margaret glanced at him briefly before her attention was drawn back to the crinkling paper. They financed all of this, Leo mumbled under his breath, his words almost lost in the low hum of conversation, but Margaret caught them anyway. His voice had that flat, matter-of-fact quality, the kind that said he had been observing more than he let on. "I know," Margaret replied softly, her voice steady. She didn't need to say more. It was all too clear. The credit, the loans, the leveraged assets. They were as visible as the polished countertops, as the stainless steel appliances. This was not a home built on years of careful planning or inherited wealth. It was a monument to what they hoped to have, a shiny shell meant to impress. But it was all borrowed time, borrowed money, pretending to be something it wasn't. She could feel it now, like the hum of electricity in the walls, the unspoken truth that there was nothing solid beneath the gleam of newness. Margaret turned her gaze away from the statement, careful to keep her expression neutral. There was no need to point it out. Not yet. She simply let the moment sit between them, the tension bubbling just under the surface. She had seen this all before. 1,000 times. People living like they were already on top, pretending that the weight of their borrowed money didn't hang heavy over them. Vanessa was still talking, her voice floating in the background. But Margaret's mind was elsewhere, focused on the statement she'd spotted. It was tucked half under the corner of a pile of unopened bills so easily missed. But Margaret never missed anything. Her eyes flicked back down, her gaze flicking over the envelope's details. A HELOC statement. The date, the lender, the amount. It was all there. A cold, hard record of what lay beneath the glossy surface of the house. Margaret had been prepared for this. Of course, she had. She let the scene unfold around her, taking in the brand names, the designer furniture, the gleaming surfaces, all of it so meticulously crafted to look like success. But the house was nothing but a shell, an image, a stage set for a life they had yet to build. And as Vanessa moved toward the dining room, still expounding on the virtues of her new appliances, Margaret tucked the information she had just gathered into the corner of her mind, filing it away like a key to a door that had yet to be opened. She had no intention of confronting them, not yet. But they would know, eventually. And when they did, they would have no one but themselves to blame. Margaret smiled to herself, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. The game had already begun. The house might have smelled like credit, but Margaret had a far more permanent scent. The kind that lingered long after the walls were built and the bills were paid. The kind of scent that came from a power too quiet to brag about, but far too real to ignore. And soon enough, they would all realize that. The Morning Light Cooperative was tucked quietly at the end of a tree-lined street in Greenville. Its modest brick building almost unassuming against the backdrop of fast-developing neighborhoods. Yet, within its walls, Margaret had built something far more enduring than the house Eric and Vanessa now flaunted. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the cold gloss of her son's home. It was warm, not from expensive lighting or polished wood, but from something deeper, more lasting. The air felt lived in, filled with the quiet hum of people working towards something greater than themselves. Carolyn was waiting for her in the conference room, where the table gleamed with quiet purpose. She was reviewing papers, as usual, a calm and methodical presence even as the world around her seemed to rush towards something new. Carolyn had always been like that, steadfast, unhurried in a world obsessed with speed. Margaret paused at the doorway, taking a moment to breathe in the air of this place. It felt like the opposite of the house she'd just left. Real, grounded. Morning Light wasn't built on credit, or appearances, or borrowed time. It was built on a vision, on years of patient work. Margaret's work. "Morning," Carolyn said, her voice as crisp and sharp as always, though there was a hint of something warmer when she saw Margaret. I've got the update for you on the grant. Margaret nodded and walked over, settling into her seat across from Carolyn. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the table. It was calm here, the contrast to the chaos of her son's house palpable. "You're sure the grant's going smoothly?" Margaret asked, though she knew the answer. Carolyn glanced at her, a knowing look in her eyes. "Better than expected. The new family wing is coming along beautifully. We're naming it in your honor, the Margaret Cole Housing Initiative." Margaret's eyes softened for a moment, but she didn't let her smile show. "I'm glad it's making a difference, but I'd rather it stayed quiet, Carolyn. Just for now." Carolyn raised an eyebrow, but she nodded. "You've always preferred to remain behind the scenes, but you've earned it, Margaret. You've earned this." Margaret didn't reply right away. Instead, she reached for the file in front of her, flipping it open to the most recent updates. It had been years since she'd been directly involved with Morning Light, years since her donations had started making the kind of impact that people noticed. 31 family homes, a legacy built quietly, without a single soul knowing her name, except for a small handful of trusted people, like Carolyn. And now, here she was, once again shaping the future, but from the shadows. Carolyn cleared her throat, breaking Margaret's thoughts. "I've got something else you might find interesting." Margaret looked up. "What's that?" "The Chandler House," Carolyn said, tapping her pen against the file. "It's tied to one of your trust properties. Parcel 19. The land under their house? It belongs to you." Margaret sat up straighter, her heart skipping a beat. "So, they're living in one of mine, without knowing it?" Carolyn nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "That's right. The house they're so proud of is built on land that was always part of your trust. They've been living there for months now, completely unaware." Margaret leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information. The house she had just visited, the one filled with brand new furniture and expensive appliances, all so carefully curated, rested on land that had been part of her long before it had ever belonged to Eric and Vanessa. They didn't even know. "And mocking me on borrowed land," Margaret said, her voice as smooth as velvet, but with a coldness that cut through the air. The irony of it hit her, a quiet satisfaction curling at the edges of her lips. She had watched them play their game, pretending that the wealth they'd shown off was something they had built. But it wasn't theirs. Not really. Margaret could feel the weight of this revelation settle around her, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together. She had never meant for things to play out this way, but the game, it was already in motion. They would eventually realize what was happening, and when they did, it would be too late. "Do you think they'll ever figure it out?" Margaret asked, her gaze drifting back to the window, as if she could see the Chandler house from here, just beyond the horizon. Carolyn didn't hesitate. "They'll either figure it out, or they'll keep on pretending. Either way, the truth is already there, Margaret, and when it comes out, it won't be you who's caught off guard." Margaret smiled quietly to herself. The long game was still in motion, and now, things were about to get interesting. She had prepared for this moment for years, silently pulling the strings, letting them believe they were in control when, in fact, she had always been the one holding the cards. She looked back at Carolyn. "Good. Keep me updated, but don't say anything about the grant for now. Let them keep thinking I'm invisible." "Understood," Carolyn replied, and Margaret knew that her old friend would handle everything as she always had, with precision, discretion, and a quiet authority that matched her own. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate. "The house might smell like credit, but what I've built, it's not going anywhere." She glanced back at Carolyn with a small but knowing smile. "And soon, they'll understand exactly what that means." She walked out of the office, feeling the weight of the quiet power she held. Soon enough, everything would come full circle. The offices of Stanton and Brody were the embodiment of legal precision, clean lines, modern furnishings, and an air of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Margaret stepped into the conference room with the same quiet assurance she had carried with her all her life. The polished walnut table gleamed under the soft light, and the air smelled faintly of new books and leather-bound files, a reminder that the business of land and legacy had little room for sentiment. It was all about paper, signatures, and the movement of things that couldn't be touched, until, of course, it was time to take them back. Paige Brody, the estate attorney, was already there, standing by the window with a steady look on her face. There was no small talk as Margaret entered, only the faintest acknowledgement in the lawyer's eyes. Paige had seen it all, the machinations of the wealthy, the quiet battles fought behind the scenes. Margaret didn't need to explain herself here. The business of the day was already clear. "Everything's ready," Paige said, her voice clipped, businesslike. "We've finalized the title reassignment for Parcel 19. The land is officially back in your name." Margaret nodded, her hands resting calmly on the table. She was used to control. The idea of reclaiming what had always been hers didn't feel like a victory, but more like the closing of a chapter. The paperwork before her was just a formality, the result of years of quiet strategy. The kind of strategy Vanessa and Eric, in their rush to climb, would never understand. She sat down across from Paige, her eyes gliding over the documents, taking in the details with the practiced precision that had always defined her. She ran a finger along the line where her name would go, the ink of the legal words forming a final, irreversible truth. Margaret picked up the pen and signed without hesitation. "Good," Margaret said, her voice steady. "That should clean things up." Paige didn't immediately respond. She sat back in her chair, watching Margaret as if waiting for something more. But there was nothing more to say. The land was hers again. The mortgage on the Chandler house now solely in Eric and Vanessa's hands. The house that had been so carefully curated, the one that smelled like credit, was about to feel the weight of its own foundation. And that, Margaret knew, would be the beginning of the unraveling. As she placed the pen back on the table, a fleeting thought crossed her mind. How long would it take before Vanessa realized what had been done? How long before Eric, in his stubborn denial, started questioning everything he thought he understood? There was no rush. The pieces were already in motion, and once the truth settled in, they would have no choice but to confront it. Margaret stood slowly, her hands gathering the signed documents. The cold, calculating efficiency of this moment felt right. She had been patient, and now, everything was falling into place. The phone in her purse buzzed as she turned to leave, and she saw the notification. Vanessa's latest post on Instagram. A picture of their newly remodeled kitchen, the stainless steel appliances shining like trophies under the flattering filter. Her caption read, "Love building something from scratch." Margaret felt a flicker of something cold pass through her chest. "Built on a foundation she didn't pour," Carolyn's voice echoed in her mind, her words sharp and steady from their earlier conversation. Margaret's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Vanessa's pride, so easily displayed for the world to see, was about to be shattered by the truth of her own borrowed success. The house that she believed she had built was already built on someone else's ground. The land beneath her feet, that gleaming kitchen, and all the appearances they had crafted. It wasn't theirs. Not in the way they thought. Outside the conference room window, the city of Greenville stretched out, sprawling and ambitious, its skyline still in the process of rebranding itself, just like the Chandler house. It was a place of illusions, a place where things looked permanent, even if they were built on shifting sands. And like everything else, the truth about those sands would come to the surface sooner or later. Margaret turned to Paige, who had already returned to her work, her focus back on the papers in front of her. "You'll file these, of course," Margaret said, her voice calm but with the weight of finality. "Of course," Paige replied without looking up. Margaret paused for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob. There was nothing left to do here. The job was done. As she stepped into the hallway, she allowed herself one last quiet smile. It was a smile that held no triumph, only the slow burn of inevitability. She had played her cards well, and soon it would be Eric and Vanessa who would need to answer for their borrowed dreams. For now, she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers, but it was never about the land. It was about the power that came with knowing when to hold your ground, and she had always known. The Chandler house was brimming with people when Margaret arrived, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses spilling out onto the carefully manicured lawn. The night was warm, the kind of early summer evening that made everything look just a little bit more glamorous, a little more polished. The patio lights twinkled above, casting soft halos over the gathering. A perfect glittering vision of success. If anyone knew how to throw a party, it was Vanessa. She was practically glowing, her smile wide and practiced, as she floated through the crowd, making sure everyone noticed her latest accomplishment. Margaret stood at the edge of it all, silently observing, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She didn't need the drink. It was the distraction of her fingers running along the smooth, cool glass that calmed her mind. Not the bubbles. But it gave her something to do while the scene unfolded around her. Vanessa waved her arm grandly, her voice carrying above the chatter as guests admired the spacious patio and the perfectly placed fire pit. "All ours," she declared, her tone triumphant, though there was something in it, a bit too much emphasis perhaps. "No shortcuts." Margaret's gaze drifted over the area, taking in the flawless landscape design and the freshly painted trim. Every detail was in place, every corner sharp and well-defined. She could almost smell the newness of it all, fresh paint, freshly dug soil, and that distinctly hollow smell of things not yet lived in. This wasn't home. This was a stage set for an act that would never be performed. From the corner of her eye, she caught Leo, standing near the edge of the crowd, looking a little uncomfortable in his too tight blazer. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Margaret gave him a subtle nod, and for a brief second she saw his lips curl into a small, uncertain smile. He was trying, in his own quiet way, to understand the pieces of the world around him. Margaret was content to let him figure it out in his own time. Her attention returned to Vanessa, who was still holding court in the middle of the crowd, her laughter ringing out a bit too loud, a bit too insistent. It was a sound that didn't quite match the scene around them, a celebration of something built on illusions. Margaret sipped her water again, watching the bartender as he worked, moving with practiced ease among the guests. When he set a fresh glass in front of her, she placed a crisp bill in his palm without a second thought. She was a woman of quiet gestures, of small movements that held weight far beyond their size. A tip, a glance, a well-placed word. All things she'd learned over the years. Eric was holding a drink in his hand, standing by the bar, talking in circles with an older couple. As he caught Margaret's eye, he made his way over, his face splitting into a smile that was just a little too wide. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the smile of a man trying to convince himself of something. "Mom, I'm glad you could make it," he said, clapping her gently on the back. "To see the progress. The house. It's really coming together." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her lips still curved into the faintest of smiles. "It certainly is," she said quietly, her gaze flickering to the towering structure behind him, the house that had taken shape over the course of their years together. And yet, somehow, it wasn't enough. It was beautiful, no doubt. but it was hollow, empty, in a way. To building something our son can be proud of, Eric said, lifting his glass in a toast, his words light. But there was something strained in the way he said it. A hint of tension, of trying too hard to make it sound natural. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She took a long sip of her water, the bubbles cool against her tongue. "Let's hope he remembers who started it," she said, her voice calm but cutting, the words precise and measured. The room seemed to pause for a moment, just a beat too long. Vanessa, still at the center of it all, laughed. But there was a crack in it, an uncomfortable tension that rose at the edges of her smile. "She means you, Eric." "Of course," Vanessa said, trying to brush it off with a forced chuckle, but Margaret could see it. She could feel the moment shift in the air, like the subtle change of pressure before a storm. The laughter died off quickly, leaving a brief silence hanging between them. Margaret could see Vanessa's discomfort now, her eyes darting quickly between her husband and Margaret. Eric shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time that night, Margaret felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction. She had done nothing but speak the truth, but in this room full of pretense, it had been enough to unsettle them. She felt no glee in it, but it was a reminder that the world they had so carefully built, the illusion of wealth, of control, could be disrupted by something as simple as a few words. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret understood the power of silence, the way it carried weight, the way it had the potential to make everything else feel just a little less certain. Leo moved toward her then, his awkward stance shifting into something more confident as he approached, his smile warmer than before. "Do you want me to take that drink?" he asked, nodding to her glass. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Margaret studied him for a moment, seeing something in him that was beginning to unfold. He was beginning to see. "Not yet, Leo," she said softly, her voice steady, her gaze never leaving the crowd. "Not yet." And for just a moment, as she stood there, watching the crowd swirl around her, Margaret felt the slow, certain shift in the air. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. The morning light spilled through the windows of the Chandler house, casting long, quiet shadows over the sleek, pristine furniture. It was a picture of comfort, the kind of home that seemed perfect for a life Margaret had never fully been able to understand. But today, that picture was starting to crack. Vanessa sat at the kitchen island, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the envelope in front of her. The certified letter was thick with official weight, the kind of document that only ever carried news you didn't want to hear. Her nails scraped against the paper as she read the first line, her eyes widening with confusion, then panic. She read it again, slower this time, her pulse quickening. "The land title under this property has been reassigned to Margaret Cole, effective immediately." Her breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. She didn't understand. She couldn't. The house, everything they had worked for, everything they had flaunted, was built on land that wasn't theirs. Not anymore. Vanessa's hand flew to her phone, fingers shaking as she dialed Eric's number. It rang once, twice before he picked up, his voice still thick with sleep. "Eric, you need to see this." Vanessa's voice was tight, frantic. "The land. It's been reassigned. It's in her name. It's hers again. What the hell is going on?" Eric groaned, the sound muffled, before he answered, more awake now. "What? What do you mean reassigned?" "I mean..." Vanessa's voice wavered as she held the letter out, even though he wasn't there to see it. "The land under the house, Eric. It's hers now. Margaret's. This isn't a joke." There was a long pause, and Vanessa could almost hear Eric's mind working, piecing together what was happening. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, raw with disbelief. "She did this? She can't just take it." I don't know, Eric, Vanessa snapped, the panic creeping into her voice. But she has. It's done. The house. It's all built on borrowed land. And now, it's hers again. Eric cursed under his breath. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa could almost hear him pacing, a wayward thought crossing her mind. Had he ever truly understood what had been at stake? They had always been playing in her shadow, pretending to have control when the ground beneath them had already been claimed. "I'll call the lawyer," Eric finally muttered, but there was no confidence in his voice. No certainty. "I'll figure this out." But as the call ended and the quiet of the house settled back in, Vanessa found herself alone with the mess of it all. The house, their home, the one they'd bragged about so much, the one Vanessa had posted about on social media just days ago, had been built on a foundation that wasn't theirs. And now, it seemed, the truth was coming to the surface. Margaret wasn't answering her calls. The morning stretched on in a blur. Vanessa found herself checking her phone every few minutes, growing more and more restless as time passed. Why hadn't Margaret reached out yet? Why hadn't she called, to make sure they knew who was in control? But then Carolyn's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, the ground beneath her feet shifted again. She answered quickly, her voice shaking with frustration and a hint of desperation. "Carolyn, what's happening?" she asked. "Why did Margaret do this? Why is the land back in her name?" Carolyn's voice came through steady and calm. Too calm. "Good morning, Vanessa. I'm sure you've seen the paperwork. The land title reassignment was part of the trust's legal adjustments. The paperwork was always in order, just not processed until now." Vanessa clenched the phone tighter, trying to keep her composure. "But why didn't anyone tell us? Why was this kept a secret?" "I'm afraid it wasn't a secret," Carolyn replied evenly. "It's just that you've been unaware of the finer details of your family's holdings. But that's not your fault. You've had the house to focus on. Margaret's always kept her affairs quiet." "Margaret," Vanessa said bitterly, her teeth clenched. "She's trying to humiliate us." Carolyn paused, a slight hesitation. Then, in her usual composed tone, she added, "This wasn't about humiliation, Vanessa. It's about business. And if you want to fix this, you'll need to work within the framework she's laid out. The paperwork just caught up." The words hung in the air, too heavy, too final. Vanessa's mind reeled, but the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret had been playing the long game. All these years, all this time, quietly waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was hers. And now, it was done. The land was hers again, and everything Eric and Vanessa had worked for, every bit of pride they had shown off, it was built on borrowed ground. And Margaret hadn't even had to say a word. The silence that followed Carolyn's words felt suffocating. Vanessa's fingers gripped the phone, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. She was too caught in the weight of the moment. Too caught in the realization that they had never truly been in control. And for the first time, Vanessa realized that it wasn't the house or the land that Margaret had taken from them. It was the illusion that they had built. The illusion that they had earned everything they had. And now, the truth was out. The morning was still young when Leo arrived at Margaret's house, the sun barely climbing above the trees, casting dappled light across the front yard. He had texted her earlier, asking if he could stop by. A simple question, but one that carried a quiet weight. Margaret knew it was coming. She had expected this moment, even if it was still a bit too soon. Leo was like that, always trying to piece things together, trying to make sense of the world around him. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when he knocked softly on the door, the polite tap of a young man still trying to figure out where he stood in the world. She motioned for him to come in, her movements measured, her face calm, though she could sense his unease. "Morning, Grandma," Leo said, standing in the doorway, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. There was a hesitation in his posture, a slight discomfort that told Margaret all she needed to know. "Morning, Leo," she replied, her voice steady, offering him the space to speak, knowing he wouldn't come here unless he had questions that needed answering. He stepped inside, glancing around as if seeing the house for the first time. Margaret had lived here for years, and while she hadn't made any grand attempts to impress, her home had always been an oasis of calm, a place that had its own quiet history, even if no one else seemed to notice it. He sat across from her at the table, his eyes searching her face, trying to read between the lines, just as he always had. "Is this true?" Leo asked finally, his voice quieter now, his eyes meeting hers. You own the land under our house?" Margaret nodded slowly, her expression unchanged, as calm and composed as it had always been. She didn't need to hide the truth from Leo. He had always been perceptive, seeing things others missed. "It's always been part of a trust your father ignored," Margaret said simply, the words matter of fact, as if they were just another piece of the puzzle, another fact in the ledger of her life. Leo sat back, his brow furrowed as if trying to absorb the weight of what that meant. "But how? Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret took a slow breath, folding her hands on the table in front of her. "Your father never asked. He assumed he knew everything, assumed things would stay as they were, but he never truly understood what was at stake. After your grandfather passed, I had to protect the family's assets. It wasn't just about keeping things intact. It was about ensuring we'd still have something when everything else started to shift." Leo's eyes flicked to the window, then back to her, his gaze focused, trying to unravel the layers of her words. He looked younger in that moment, his uncertainty making him seem like a boy again, unsure of how to navigate the world his parents had built for him. "You knew this whole time?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That this was going to happen?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I've known for years. It wasn't the right time to say anything. Not until they showed me who they really were." Leo shifted in his seat, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "Did you mean for them to find out this way? Through the paperwork?" Margaret's gaze softened for a moment, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "I meant for them to act like family before they acted like heirs." The words hung in the air, heavy with their meaning. Margaret had always been about family first. That was the principle she had upheld when her husband passed away, when Eric was still too young to see the broader picture. Now it was clear that Eric had allowed his ambition, his pride, to cloud his judgment. The house, the land, it was always meant to be a quiet inheritance, a gift, not something to be flaunted and consumed in the rush to appear successful. And Leo, despite the confusion, was starting to understand that. Leo's gaze softened, his voice small now, almost hesitant. "I didn't know. I mean, I don't think anyone did." Margaret nodded, her face still calm but with an undercurrent of something else. "Your parents have their own way of doing things. It's always been about appearances, Leo. You've seen it. But what's real? What matters? That's not something you find in a house or a bank account." For a moment they both sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Leo opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, unsure of what to say next. "You're not angry with them?" Leo finally asked, his voice still unsure. "No," Margaret said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not angry, but I'm not going to watch them squander everything either. They need to learn. And maybe, Leo, you'll be the one who shows them how." Leo's eyes searched her face, the meaning of her words sinking in. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret smiled, a quiet smile that spoke volumes. "I want you to remember what's important, and I want you to be the man who knows what to stand for, even when the world around you is changing. Leo's eyes brightened just a little, the uncertainty still there, but now mixed with a sense of understanding. I'll do that. Maybe I'll start by mowing your lawn this weekend. Margaret chuckled softly, the sound like a gentle breeze. That's a good start. As Leo stood to leave, Margaret watched him for a moment. A quiet pride swelling in her chest. There was hope in him yet, a hope that hadn't been extinguished by the world's illusions. He had seen past the surface, and in doing so, he was beginning to understand the real work that had always been at hand. Margaret turned to the window, her thoughts drifting as Leo stepped out the door. She had done what she needed to do, and now it was his turn. The truth was always in the details. And for the first time, it seemed like someone in the Chandler family was starting to see them. Margaret had been invited to dinner, though she knew this was not a typical invitation. The Chandler house was a carefully curated display of wealth and status, something built to impress, but underpinned by a hollowness that, for once, was starting to come into focus. It had taken years for her to come to this moment, but now the pieces were falling into place with chilling precision. When she arrived, the house felt as polished as ever, the air scented with the faintest trace of roasted vegetables and the promise of a well-mannered evening. Margaret could already sense the tension, the crackling energy that hovered just beneath the surface of the usual pleasantries. Vanessa had been insistent on the dinner, as though it were some form of reconciliation, but Margaret knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation, it was about control. And they were going to learn exactly how little they had left. The dining room table was set with quiet perfection, gleaming china, silver forks aligned in a perfectly precise manner. Vanessa was already standing by the table, her smile strained as she gestured for Margaret to sit. The smile was too wide, too practiced. There was no warmth in it. "Please, Mom," Eric said, looking up from where he'd been inspecting a wine glass, his voice carrying a slight edge of forced civility. "We're glad you could make it." His eyes, however, betrayed him, darting from the table to Margaret with an apprehensive glance. Margaret didn't say anything. She simply sat, her movements deliberate, and the quiet hum of the evening wrapped itself around them like an invisible thread. There was no need for words yet. It was coming, and they all knew it. Vanessa cleared her throat, a sound that caught in the still air of the room. "Before we start," she said, her voice just a little too high-pitched, "Eric and we've had time to think about things, and we want to say we're sorry, really, if this situation has been confusing." Margaret glanced at her, the faintest of smiles pulling at her lips. "Confusing?" she repeated, her voice low, careful. "Or inconvenient?" Vanessa's face tightened, her eyes flitting quickly to Eric before returning to Margaret. "It's just, we're a family," she said, her words now flowing in a rehearsed cadence, as though she had practiced them in front of a mirror. All of this feels harsh, vindictive. You've made your point, but we're still family, Margaret. You can't just hold all of this over us." Margaret's gaze never wavered. She didn't need to speak right away. The silence, the weight of the moment, was enough. They had their speech prepared, their facade of family unity hanging by a thread. But it wasn't the words that would tear them apart. It was the truth. "Vindictive," Margaret repeated, nodding slowly, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Or maybe it's just long overdue." From her bag, she pulled out a small stack of documents. She didn't need to say a word. She simply laid the trust documents on the table, then the deed, and finally, a handful of photos. Old black and white images of the land before it was developed, before the Chandler name was even tied to it. The land they now claimed as their own, built on the lies they had told themselves. Eric's eyes flicked nervously to the documents as they hit the table. He swallowed hard, his face losing color as he scanned the pages. Vanessa's smile faltered entirely, her lips pressing into a thin line as she glanced down at the papers, the realization slowly dawning on her. "You said I live off the past," Margaret said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Turns out, so do you." The words landed like stones in the middle of the room, heavy and inevitable. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She glanced at Eric, searching for something, an answer, a defense, but found none. Eric cleared his throat, his face reddening as his gaze shifted from the documents to Margaret's unwavering face. This isn't how it's supposed to work," he said, his voice tight. "We built this. We earned it." Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "You earned nothing," she said softly. "You inherited something, yes. You enjoyed it, yes. But you never earned it. It was always mine to begin with. And now it's mine again." Eric's mouth moved, but no words came out. Vanessa's face had gone white, the blood draining from her cheeks as she processed the truth of what Margaret had just laid out before them. This was no longer a matter of wills or debts. It was a matter of legacy, something they had never truly understood. Margaret folded the papers with deliberate care, placing them back into her bag. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. But she wasn't done. She stood slowly, her movements measured, each one infused with purpose. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "The meatloaf was lovely. I'll take my leave now." Vanessa looked up, her eyes wide, her expression caught between disbelief and anger. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Just like that?" Margaret smiled, the hint of a quiet victory in her eyes. "Yes, Vanessa, just like that." As she made her way to the door, she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their unspoken questions pressing down like a final curtain. She wasn't finished yet. They weren't done learning. But tonight, Margaret had set the record straight. And there was no going back from this. The air at Morning Light was thick with anticipation as Margaret walked through the doors. There was no fanfare, no loud applause, just a quiet hum of voices, soft conversations about the day's events, families walking in and out of the newly renovated spaces. The place was alive with purpose, something that had been carefully built and nurtured over the years. Margaret had been a silent partner in this endeavor, funding homes, offering support without anyone ever knowing her name. Today was different. She hadn't wanted any attention, had actively avoided it. But as she stepped into the community center, the truth of it all settled in. The space before her, bright and welcoming, now housed the new wing of the Morning Light Cooperative, and it bore her name. The sign stood at the entrance to the new addition, the Margaret Cole Housing Initiative. Margaret stood there for a moment, the weight of the gesture heavy but satisfying. She wasn't one for recognition, but this was her legacy. It wasn't a flashy monument, nor was it built on vanity. It was something real, something that would matter for generations to come. Carolyn was there, as always, standing a little to the side, watching the dedication with a knowing smile. She'd been with Margaret every step of the way, a trusted friend and advisor, and it was her quiet influence that had kept this project grounded, practical. There would be no speeches, no grand ceremony. Margaret had asked for no such thing. She just wanted a plaque, a small, quiet tribute and peace. A few families milled about in the community kitchen, laughing and chatting as volunteers served food. Margaret's eyes wandered to the back wall, where, tucked among photographs of residents and workers, was a new addition. A framed photo of her and Carolyn, their faces slightly smiling, standing together in front of a completed home. It was a quiet, unassuming picture, but to Margaret, it was a symbol of everything that mattered. Everything she had quietly worked toward. Her eyes lingered on the photo, the pride in her chest steady, even as she felt the eyes of others flicking over the new sign and then back to her. She could sense the change, feel it ripple through the air. Vanessa's voice echoed in her mind from their last encounter. "We're still family." But family, Margaret knew, was a word that could be hollow. It was easy to say, harder to live by. A voice cut through her thoughts, and Margaret turned to see Vanessa approaching with a hesitant step, her expression pinched, her lips pressed together in that tight, practiced way that Margaret had come to recognize. Vanessa had heard about the dedication. Of course she had. It was impossible to miss. "You didn't tell us," Vanessa said, her voice quieter now, the accusation just barely hidden beneath the surface. "I thought that project was supposed to be anonymous." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying her daughter-in-law, whose perfect facade was starting to crack just a bit. "I chose not to stay invisible anymore," Margaret replied, her voice calm, the words deliberate. "You were right about one thing, Vanessa. I do live off the past. But I'm also building the future, not just for my family, but for others who truly need it." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, and Margaret could see the anger rising in her, the same anger she had seen before, when Vanessa had felt like the world wasn't giving her the attention she thought she deserved. "But you," Vanessa started, the words trembling in her throat. "You've been doing this all along, without telling us? Without letting us help?" "I didn't ask for your help," Margaret said softly, her tone not unkind, but final. "I did what I had to do. And I did it because it needed to be done, not because it was easy." The air between them was thick, charged with something that neither could name. Margaret wasn't angry, though she knew Vanessa expected it. She was simply tired. Tired of pretending that this surface-level life they'd all been living meant anything. Behind them, Eric stepped into view, his eyes flicking first to the plaque on the wall, then to Margaret. He said nothing at first, his hands jammed deep into his pockets as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. The years of tension between them had never been more visible than they were right now, standing in the room of a project Margaret had quietly financed for nearly a decade. She gave him a measured look, her expression unreadable. "She chose not to stay invisible anymore," Eric repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. There was no question in his tone, only the weight of realization. Margaret met his gaze. "I chose when to speak," she said softly, her eyes steady, unwavering. "That's different." For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Vanessa and Eric stood there frozen, their minds clearly racing to catch up with the truth that had been laid bare. Margaret could see it now. They were seeing it, finally. They had always been a part of her plan, but the way they had lived, so focused on appearances, so focused on winning approval from others, had been a distraction. It was never about the money or the land, or even the house. It was about legacy, and that legacy would not be tarnished by their mistakes. "You've made your point," Vanessa said finally, her voice soft. The anger in it now faded into something else. Resignation, perhaps. "But we didn't know. We never knew." Margaret gave a slow nod, but the faintest trace of something like sadness flickered across her face. "Maybe you should have paid more attention." As Margaret turned to leave, a strange peace settled over her. She had done what she needed to do. The game was over. But the truth, like the land itself, would endure, long after they had moved on. And she knew, in the quietest part of her heart, that Leo would understand. And that was enough. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when Leo arrived at Margaret's house, his steps quiet but purposeful on the gravel driveway. He was carrying a box with him, one of the many he had started to gather over the past few days. Old family photos, books, and papers from his grandfather's study. Things his mother and father had never thought to preserve, too caught up in the present to care about what had come before. Margaret was waiting for him when he stepped inside. Her expression warm but serious, the air between them charged with something unspoken. She had invited him over, not to talk about what had happened with the house, but something more, something deeper. Leo set the box down on the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the room, before he sat down across from her. She didn't speak at first, letting the quiet settle between them. After a moment, she rose and retrieved a weathered wooden box from a nearby shelf. She placed it carefully on the table, her fingers brushing the top as though it were a relic, a piece of the past that still carried weight. "These are your grandfather's letters and journals," Margaret said quietly, lifting the lid. "I thought it was time you saw them." Leo's eyes widened as he peered into the box, a mixture of curiosity and reverence on his face. There were stacks of old papers, handwritten letters, and journals bound in faded leather, the edges worn from years of being handled, passed between generations. These weren't just papers, they were fragments of a life long gone, but still so present in the way Margaret held them. Leo picked up one of the journals, its pages yellowed with age. He turned it over in his hands, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether to read aloud or keep it to himself. But Margaret's presence was steady, inviting him to dive deeper, to see what had been hidden for so long. He opened to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice soft, almost reverent. "The world is changing around us, and though I have watched my son rise in the world, I know that what truly matters cannot be built overnight. What we create must last, for our children and their children." Leo paused, lifting his eyes to meet Margaret's, the weight of the words heavy in his chest. He was building this even then. Even when everything seemed to be shifting so fast, he knew. He was building for the future. Margaret nodded, her eyes distant for a moment, as though lost in the memory of her late husband. "He believed legacy wasn't about wealth or show," she said, her voice low. "It was about responsibility. It was about ensuring that what we had built would survive, that the values we held would be passed down, not just the material things." Leo turned the pages slowly, scanning more of the letters, the words seeming to carry more weight with each passing paragraph. "I never knew he thought like this," he said, his voice tinged with something like awe. "It's like he understood the bigger picture, even when it was hard to see. He wasn't just building homes or businesses, he was building something that mattered." Margaret reached over and placed a hand on the journal, her fingers brushing against Leo's. "He didn't have the luxury of pretending that success was easy," she said softly. "He worked hard for everything we have, not for fame, not for recognition, but for us, for the family." They sat there for a long moment, the silence filling the room, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Leo felt as though he was seeing everything in a new light. His grandfather's vision, Margaret's quiet strength, and the path that had been laid out before him. After a while, Margaret stood and began to sort through the papers, carefully organizing the photos and documents. "These are just a few of the things that matter," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of sadness there too. "There's more. Things we've kept. Things that tell the true story of the family, not the one everyone sees on the surface." Leo nodded, his mind whirring with the realization that so much had been left unsaid, unspoken. "We should preserve this," he said suddenly, his voice filled with determination. "All of it. The stories, the letters, the real history. People should know what this family was really about." Margaret turned to look at him, the faintest spark of pride in her eyes. "What do you suggest?" Leo hesitated for a moment before his voice grew more confident. A website. Something simple, where people can read the stories, see the photos, learn about what really happened. Not just the part we've been told. The part that's been hidden. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You think it's time for that? Leo nodded firmly. Yes. It's time for the truth to be told. The facts. Before the photos. People need to see what really mattered. Margaret smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. Make sure the facts come before the photos, she said, the words a quiet echo of what her husband had believed all along. Leo stood, the weight of the moment settling on him. He could see the path now, the legacy his grandfather had started, and the responsibility Margaret had carried for so long. It wasn't about showing off or pretending. It was about preserving the truth for those who came after. As Leo gathered the papers and photos, his thoughts turned to the future, the one he now knew he had to help shape. And as he looked at Margaret, her steady presence filling the room, he felt ready to take on the challenge. He would make sure the past wasn't forgotten. And in doing so, maybe he'd help rewrite the future. The email came in the morning, just after Margaret had finished her coffee and was getting ready to head out to the Morning Light Cooperative. She had expected nothing, but the subject line caught her eye. An offer for family harmony. Eric's name was typed carefully in the sender field. Margaret hesitated for a moment before opening it. She had no interest in the details of their lives anymore, but she understood the need to hear him out. There was always something calculating in the way Eric presented himself, and today would be no different. She opened the message. Dear Mom, it began. I know things have been tense, and I don't want this to cause any further division. Vanessa and I have talked, and we think the best way forward is for you to sell Parcel 19 back to the family. I'm offering a fair price, one that reflects the market value, and I believe this could help restore harmony. Let's fix things for good. The words hung in the air. Margaret felt no immediate anger, just a sense of detachment. It was the same thing they had always done, trying to buy their way out of consequences, pretending as though money could smooth over everything. But the truth was already clear. The land, the house, the illusion of power. It was never about money. It was about control. And control, Margaret realized, could never be bought. She sat back in her chair, studying the email, her mind moving with deliberation. She knew Eric. She knew that this offer, dressed in pleasantries and false promises, was really just another bid for dominance. He was attempting to buy back what he had lost, to rewrite the narrative they had carefully constructed. But Margaret wasn't interested in playing his game. The phone rang as she sat there, and she answered without hesitation. Carolyn's voice, calm and steady, filled the silence. Margaret, did you see the email? Carolyn asked, though she already knew the answer. I saw it, Margaret replied, her voice even. He's offering to buy back the land. Carolyn sighed, a sound that held years of experience. I don't think you need to entertain this, Margaret. You're under no obligation. But there was a pause, and Margaret could hear the sharpness in Carolyn's voice. We can entertain it for fun, if you'd like. Margaret chuckled softly at the thought. For fun? Let him think I'll bite. It'll keep him busy for a while. Exactly, Carolyn said, her tone lightening. But seriously, you don't owe him anything. You've already made your point. You don't need to go backwards. Margaret placed the phone down slowly, feeling a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. There was no question of selling the land back. The idea was absurd. The offer, though carefully phrased, was little more than a transaction, another way for Eric to cling to the illusion of control. But Margaret had already taken control. She had already set things in motion. She pulled up a blank document on her computer and began to type a response to Eric. It wasn't a letter of anger, but of finality. She didn't need to prove anything to him anymore. What had been done, what was hers, was not up for negotiation. She hit send, then leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the desk. She felt at peace, more than she had in years. The email wasn't just a refusal. It was a statement of who she was. Not a seller, not a negotiator, but a keeper of legacy. The email read, "Eric, I appreciate the offer, but I must respectfully decline. Harmony doesn't start with paperwork, it starts with character. If you truly want to fix what's broken, you'll need to start by looking inward, not by offering to buy back what was never truly yours." Margaret. She pressed her lips together, her eyes briefly lingering on the empty chair next to her. She had made her decision. It wasn't about pride or revenge. It was about clarity. Margaret had already given enough to this family. Now, the ball was in their court. As she clicked to close her email client, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ruth's name flashing on the screen. Margaret picked it up immediately, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I just heard from Carolyn," Ruth said before Margaret could even speak. "He's mad, isn't he?" "Not just mad," Margaret replied, her voice low and thoughtful. "He's angry because the past has an invoice, and it's one he can't pay." Ruth chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "I'm guessing you sent it with postage this time?" Margaret's smile grew a little wider. "Yes, Ruth. This time I did." There was a long pause before Ruth spoke again, the amusement clear in her voice. "Good for you. But you've always known when to take the high ground. Maybe now Eric will start to see what that means." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, her gaze moving to the window. The morning light outside was steady, unhurried. Just like her. She had waited a lifetime for this moment, not for a sale, not for a compromise, for the truth. And she had delivered it in her own way. "I don't think Eric will ever see it the way I do," Margaret said softly, "but maybe Leo will. And that's enough." With a quiet satisfaction settling over her, Margaret ended the call. The decision had been made. There was no going back. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like the future was finally hers to shape. It wasn't about the land. It never had been. It was about the legacy that she would leave behind, one built on the truth, not illusions. And that, she knew, would last long after they had all moved on. The quiet hum of the house surrounded Margaret as she sat at the kitchen table, a letter and a trust document in front of her. Her fingers traced the edges of the papers, the weight of what she was about to do settling heavily in her chest. She had given so much to her family, more than they had ever understood or appreciated. But Leo, her grandson, had always been different. He saw things she couldn't explain, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The letter she had written was personal, though she hadn't yet put the finishing touches on it. It was not a letter of apology, nor was it an explanation. It was a gift, but not in the way Leo might expect. Margaret had no intention of giving him cash or property outright. Instead, she would give him something far more valuable, a future shaped by responsibility. She folded the letter carefully, placing it into the envelope with the trust document she had prepared for him. The trust, of course, had always been meant for him, though he hadn't known it. Margaret had made the decision long ago, long before Eric had started to think that money could solve everything. Leo had never asked for anything, never demanded anything. But he deserved this, not as a handout, but as a handoff. Margaret leaned back in her chair for a moment, her mind drifting back to the early days of her marriage to her late husband, when they had started building the legacy that had now been handed down to their children, and eventually, to Leo. It had never been about building an empire for the sake of wealth. It had always been about preserving something for the future, for family. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She didn't need to look to know it was Leo. His presence was always different, quieter, more introspective than the others. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice steady. As always, Leo stepped into the kitchen, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. His eyes flicked nervously to the table before meeting her gaze. "Hey, Grandma," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. "You wanted to talk?" Margaret smiled, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. She motioned for him to sit. "I do, Leo. I've been thinking about your future." Leo sat, his posture a little stiff, as if unsure of where the conversation was going. "You've been talking about it for a while now," he said, his gaze flicking to the papers on the table. Margaret nodded slowly. "I have, and now it's time to make it official." She slid the envelope across the table, her fingers lingering on it for just a moment. Leo's eyes widened slightly as he took it, but he didn't open it immediately. There was a quiet tension in the air, one that only seemed to grow with the weight of the moment. "Open it," Margaret urged gently. "It's for you." Leo carefully broke the seal, unfolding the letter and the document inside. As he read the letter, his brow furrowed, the words seeming to carry more weight with each passing line. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table, his eyes flicking back to Margaret, his face pale. "You're making me the beneficiary?" he asked quietly, the words barely a whisper. Margaret nodded. "Yes. But there are terms, Leo. This isn't a gift of convenience. It's a responsibility." Leo's hands trembled as he scanned the document. His eyes darted over the conditions, terms that Margaret had carefully considered. Completion of his education, a community grant to be awarded in his name, and most importantly, no resale of the land. It was a gift, yes, but a measured one. A future that could be shaped by his choices, not by easy cash or temporary success. I don't know what to say," Leo said softly, his voice breaking slightly as he looked up at Margaret. "You really think I'm ready for this?" Margaret smiled, her gaze steady, full of quiet pride. "I always did. I just waited for you to see it too." Leo's hands tightened around the paper as emotion surged in his chest. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the weight of everything he had never understood finally making sense. You really believe in me, don't you?" "I do," Margaret said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "I always have." For a moment, Leo couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat, and he looked down at the paper again, his chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. He had never expected anything like this, never expected her to trust him with something so important, so real. And then, before he could stop himself, Leo looked up, his eyes brimming with emotion. "I won't let you down, Grandma," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I promise." Margaret's eyes softened, her heart swelling with pride. She had made the right choice. She had given him the tools, but it was up to him to build the future. "I know you won't," she said, her voice low and warm. "But don't do it for me. Do it for yourself. Do it for the family." Leo nodded, swallowing hard as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. It was the first time Margaret had ever seen him truly moved, truly understanding what the weight of the legacy meant. There was no more pretending now. The future was real, and it was his to shape. Margaret stood, walking to the window as Leo read the document once more, his heart heavy but full of something else now. Determination. She looked out over the yard, where the trees were starting to show the first signs of spring, the earth awakening, the promise of new beginnings all around her. It was time. The past had been laid to rest, and now it was the future that would take root. The future that Leo would build. Margaret and Carolyn walked slowly through the Morning Light Cooperative neighborhood. The the cool autumn breeze ruffling the leaves above them as they moved past houses that Margaret had funded years ago. The trees lining the streets had started to turn, vibrant oranges and reds filling the branches as the world shifted into the season of change. The neighborhood, still young, felt alive with promise. It was a place that had grown from nothing, just as Margaret had hoped, and now it had its own heartbeat. "How many of these did you fund again?" Carolyn asked, her tone soft but curious. Margaret didn't look at her. She didn't need to. "All of them," she replied. "Every last one." Her eyes roamed over the tidy rows of homes, their porches decorated with pumpkins and fall wreaths, the warmth of family life spilling out into the yards. Kids were playing in the street, waving at Margaret as they ran by, their laughter a symphony of hope. A family walking to their car smiled and waved at her, a freshly baked pie tucked under the mother's arm. It was the kind of scene that could make the world seem simple again, a reminder of why she had worked so quietly, so relentlessly. For the future. For this. One of the children, a little girl, ran up to her. "Hi, Miss Margaret," she said, her grin wide and sincere. Margaret smiled and crouched down to the girl's height, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "How's school, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "Good," the girl replied brightly. "I'm going to be a teacher when I grow up. Like you." Margaret chuckled softly. "Well, you'll need to study hard for that." She paused, looking at the girl's hopeful face, and then added, "But I know you will." The little girl beamed, hugging Margaret's knees before running back to her friends. Carolyn watched the exchange, a small smile pulling at her lips. "You remember them all, don't you?" Carolyn said, her voice tinged with a quiet admiration. Margaret didn't need to look at Carolyn to know what she meant. She didn't just remember the families. She remembered the stories. She remembered the late-night phone calls with community leaders, the long hours spent planning, the quiet decisions she made without anyone knowing. It was never about fame or recognition. It was about giving people what they needed to rebuild their lives. "I remember the ones I helped stay warm," Margaret said softly, her voice laced with a mix of pride and something deeper, something more personal. They continued walking, the rhythm of their footsteps in sync with the pulse of the neighborhood. The houses were humble, but each one represented something far greater than what had appeared on the surface. They were the result of years of careful work that Margaret had done without fanfare or applause. Meanwhile, far from this place of community and growth, Vanessa sat in her living room, her eyes glued to the screen of her phone. She swiped through Instagram, her fingers moving frantically as she tried to rebrand her entire life. The carefully crafted posts about the house, the vacations, the dinners, all of it. Every single image that had once seemed like success now felt like a hollow shell, a mask that couldn't cover the truth. Her followers had started to notice. The comments, once filled with praise, had become whispers of confusion, of disappointment. Vanessa's perfectly curated world was crumbling, one post at a time. She deleted the posts quickly, hoping no one would remember. Her carefully constructed life, designed for the approval of others, had begun to unravel in the quietest of ways. Eric, on the other hand, had already made his decision. He had left town, taking a job in a neighboring state. His words to his family were simple, matter of fact. "It's temporary, just a change of pace." But Margaret knew better. It wasn't just about the job. It was about running away from what had happened, from the legacy he had lost. They both had choices to make, but they were running in opposite directions. Vanessa was trying to scrub away the evidence, pretending the past never happened. Eric, in his own way, was retreating. Running from the life he had tried to build on borrowed land, now unable to reconcile his ambition with his loss. As Margaret walked through the neighborhood, She felt no anger toward them, only a quiet sorrow. She had given them everything: a home, a future, even the opportunity to change, and they had squandered it. Her thoughts were interrupted as a family walking by stopped and waved again, this time more directly to her. The mother of the family, one of the first to move into a house Margaret had funded, called out, "Thank you, Margaret. You've made all the difference." Margaret smiled warmly, nodding her head. "It's been my pleasure," she said, her voice steady. "It's your hard work that's paid off." As the family continued down the street, the mother holding the pie to her chest, Carolyn turned to Margaret, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "You've done it," she said softly. "You've built something that will last." Margaret paused for a moment, looking over the street, the neighborhood that was now a thriving community. She could feel the weight of everything she had done, not as a victory, but as a truth that could never be erased. "It's not about them," Margaret replied quietly, her gaze steady. "It's about this. This is the legacy that matters. This is what I built." As they walked on, the cool breeze picking up, Margaret's heart settled into a quiet peace. She had given her family every opportunity. But now, it was the next generation, the ones who had truly understood what mattered, who would carry the torch forward. And that was enough. The crisp autumn air filled the streets as Margaret walked through the city, the hum of everyday life surrounding her. She had stepped out for no particular reason, other than the quiet need to be somewhere, to be out of the house, and in the world again. The past had settled, but the weight of everything still lingered, and the coat she wore, a simple woolen affair in deep navy, felt like a quiet reminder of who she was. It wasn't a flashy thing. Nothing to be paraded around, just something she had worn for years, through every season and every challenge. It was one of the few things she had never felt the need to change. The coat was more than a piece of clothing. It was a symbol, a constant, the kind of thing that people overlooked, but that Margaret had always found dignity in. Even now, as the world shifted around her, it still held the same weight it always had. It fit her perfectly, just like the decisions she had made in her life. Her steps were slow and measured as she moved past the rows of shops and cafes, the golden light of late afternoon filtering through the buildings. The city was alive in its own way, bustling with the promise of the future. Margaret had never been one for distractions, but today, she let herself feel the pulse of it, the constant motion of the world around her. There was something grounding about it, like the quiet certainty of knowing that everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was standing firm. When she reached the park bench, the familiar place where she and Leo had often met for quiet moments, she sat down. The bench was bathed in a soft glow from the fading sunlight, and she rested her hands on the edges, her fingers brushing the worn wood. She let out a breath, steadying herself in the moment. The world had changed, but in this space, with the soft chill of the evening settling in, she felt grounded. A moment later, Leo arrived, his footsteps light on the pavement. He held a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and offered it to Margaret as he sat down beside her. She took it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her fingers. "Thanks, Leo," she said quietly, her voice steady, though a smile tugged at her lips. He nodded, sitting beside her, his body relaxed, but still carrying a quiet intensity. They didn't speak at first, content in the silence, watching the families walk past, parents with children, older couples strolling arm in arm, the steady rhythm of life going on around them. Leo was the first to break the silence. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said softly, his voice full of something deeper than just praise. It was the kind of statement that meant more than words alone. "You did it. You built something that's lasting. I didn't know what it really meant until now. The land, the houses, It's more than just buildings. It's hope. Margaret's smile deepened, though she didn't say anything right away. She took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the warmth fill her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost reflective. You never raised your voice, Leo continued, glancing over at her, his expression thoughtful. But you made your point. You didn't need to shout. Margaret chuckled softly, her gaze steady. She set the coffee down on the bench beside her and slowly unbuttoned her coat. The familiar fabric creased slightly under her fingers, and as she reached into the lining, her hand brushed against something small and crinkled. She pulled out the old receipt from that dinner, the one where everything had changed. It was still there, tucked deep in the coat she had worn that night, as if to remind her, as if to remind the world, that sometimes things were settled without a single word spoken. Leo watched her as she unfolded the receipt, the soft crinkle of the paper sounding louder than usual in the stillness between them. Margaret smoothed it flat with practiced fingers, the faint imprint of the numbers and letters reflecting the weight of all that had transpired. The dinner, the words, the truth that had settled into the air like dust. Margaret held the receipt in her hands for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges. Then she folded it carefully, tucking it back into the lining of her coat. The small gesture wasn't about the bill itself, but about what it had represented. A mark, a reminder that even the smallest of things could change everything. You said I live off the past, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. The bill said otherwise. Leo was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her face. He didn't need to ask. He knew exactly what she meant. She had always kept the truth close to her chest, but in moments like this, it was clear. The past had always been part of her foundation. It had shaped her, but it didn't control her. She had never been afraid to confront it, and that was the difference. That was what had made her stand apart. They sat in silence for a while, the cool breeze lifting the fallen leaves around them, the sun beginning to set behind the trees. It was peaceful, a moment suspended in time, as if the world had paused to allow them this quiet understanding. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, Margaret felt more sure of herself than she had in years. Leo sat back on the bench, the quiet understanding between them settling into a comfortable rhythm. You did it, Grandma, he said again, his voice full of respect. You showed them what really matters. Margaret smiled, her eyes soft. I just waited for you to see it too. They sat there together, watching the families crossing the street, the sounds of life surrounding them. But for once, it felt like everything had fallen into place. At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law mocked me for living off the past. The bill said otherwise. And Margaret knew, as she sat beside Leo, that the past, the present, and the future were all part of the same story. And now, the legacy she had built was finally being understood.